All right, well, here we are on the final day of steelhead season, April 30th. Those of you who have looked at previous reports are going to notice the river looks quite different. I would put visibility at about 1 foot. I would say I took a temperature when I first got here. It is 40 degrees, and the reason it's so cool is because of all of the snow up high that's melting. It's going to be 80 degrees here today, so obviously we've moved into the big runoff season. There is 3 times as much water in the river now as there was during the meat of the steelhead season, and it will go another 3x increase from here over the month of May, which is really funny because even at its highest, I managed to find some places last year where I can still fish and catch plenty of cutthroat. But I figured rather than doing some boring written review of my steelhead season, I figured I would just take you along fishing with me in these less than perfect conditions today and kind of talk as I go. As far as number of fish, I would say I hooked about a third as many fish as I thought I would, that being about a dozen. I think I did hook exactly a dozen steelhead with a pretty good amount of effort, especially early season where I was fishing down by the hatchery creek so much. That was a little frustrating because it was still so cold. That the ice jams way downstream of here were not melting away. And of the guys I've talked to who fished pretty hard this season, the best way to summarize it is like this. We ended up having a very short season because these steelhead were trapped so far downstream by the ice jams for so long that by the time things warmed up, those fish were on a beeline to their spawning grounds, whether that be a hatchery or their spawning beds upstream of here. And what I found, and what was kind of confirmed by some of the people I talked to, was that the fish that did show up initially were not great biters. You know, when you have go-to things that have worked in the past and you're putting them right where the fish were in the past and you're not hooking up, it's usually because either the fish aren't there or the fish are not in the mood. I think it was a combination of both this year. There are now 2,500 fish back to the hatchery that I mentioned in earlier reports, and there are now 700 fish back to the hatchery that's another 40 miles up from here. So there's got to be fish in the river spread out between here and there, but in these conditions, now that the runoff has started, it's tough fishing, but that's okay. The fact of the matter is that even though I only caught a dozen steelhead, to say that is kind of ridiculous, because any season you catch a few steelhead is a good season, even where your expectations are that much higher because of past seasons. So my friend that comes into town and has his trailer here for the better part of the month of April, who fishes way more hours than I do, but we fish very similar strategies. He caught about half as many steelhead this year, maybe a little less than half as many steelhead this year as he did the previous year. And according to what he said, he put in just as much, if not more, effort this year. So it's one of those things where, you know, you start to second guess your go-to methods, and you start to second guess your manlyhood essentially, when you're not hooking the numbers of steelhead that you thought you were going to. But that's just silliness. Everyone I've talked to agrees with my general summary of the season that it started very late because of our unbelievable winter. That just seemed like it lasted forever. And then having the fish all show up at once and having them be really moving constantly, just like they were in a hurry to get to their spawning grounds. And I think that's a pretty accurate summation of the way the season went. So as far as highlights for this season, I would say the number one highlight was that these fish proved to me, and I shared with my friend Jack, a method that worked for winter steelhead back when I lived in Washington, but really shined a little bit in our super cold water with fish that weren't exactly cooperative, and that was fishing a Colorado spinner under a float, which is something I used to do quite a bit for winter runs in Washington. You got to remember, these are summer run fish, meaning they came out of the Pacific Ocean last summer, and we're only fishing them in the winter because it takes them that long to get here. It's got to be a nice stick. So in other words, I have always treated these fish kind of with my summer run tactics, even though we're fishing in this cold water situation, fishing in the winter. And so anyway, a Colorado spinner under a float is something that I really truly love to fish because it has the best aspects of float fishing, namely that you're just waiting anxiously for that bobber down, and but yet underneath your float, instead of just having a jig or a stonefly imitation or something like that, you are fishing hardware. And my history with steelheading is that sometimes the most violent, dramatic strikes you get from these fish are when you're fishing hardware. I used to swing spoons quite a bit, again, for winter runs in Washington. But fishing a Colorado blade is just a way to go. And so I had one day, I believe it was April 20th, where I fished through some water that Jack had already hit with our normal float and jig method, and I came back through with my Colorado and hooked up twice in the space of about 10 minutes, and they were both beautiful fish. The very first one that I got on the Colorado was a wild fish that was just in great shape. And then the second one was a little bit bigger hatchery fish that also took the silver plated, I believe it was a number 3, size 3 Colorado blade. And that was just like incredible. So that was a highlight. Another highlight was that I took my friend D, who I had essentially promised a steelhead, which is always a dangerous thing to do because you get that ego check when you got to be reminded that it is steelhead we're fishing for here, and they are unpredictable. And although I've had some incredible days with multiple fish and thought I had it all figured out, the beauty of these steelhead is they'll come back and remind you that you don't really know shit, and what worked last year might not work this year, and the water you fished last year might not hold fish. And it's the challenge of it. It's part of the glory of hooking a steelhead. And so again, like hooking a dozen fish this year, comparing it to other years, whether it be fishing here or fishing back in Washington for winter runs, a dozen is a bad year, but that's just That's just silly talk, because a season in which you hooked a dozen steelhead is awesome. But we did end up getting Dee hooked up with a really nice hatchery hen, and we got a good video out of it. And we could have kept that fish, but we let it go. So that was another highlight. And then I guess kind of an overall riding highlight in a sense was that this season reminded me or taught me to continue thinking outside the box, because the way last season ended, I figured I had it absolutely dialed with one of my particular jigs, the way I was fishing it, where I was fishing it. I just figured it was gonna be too easy this year. But then I realized Jack, with so much more time on the water and the things that he was throwing at these fish and what he was having success on, I needed to expand my horizons back out a little bit and fish some of my other methods, because I definitely had it proven to me again this year. I went through the space right across the stream from here. I fished it really hard and really well with one method, and I was kind of convinced there wasn't any fish home at that moment, but instead of just packing it in and going somewhere else, I grabbed my second rod that had my Pat Stone jig on it, where I had been fishing one of my bead jigs, and very first cast I hooked a fish. So I know that fish had been sitting there and was just rejecting what I threw at him initially, and then when I changed up, that's when the fish hit. And that's always a good reminder in all kinds of fishing, that sometimes you gotta, stupid cliche, think outside the box. And just keep your options open. Don't get stuck on one method of fishing. And I don't know if you can notice in the camera, but I got a very small little tangle in my braided line, and you can tell that it's the end of the season, that I'm not immediately there it is right there, floating kind of out in the, I'm not immediately clipping that and retying it and everything, because today is literally the last day of the season. Well, lo and behold, right after I turned the camera off, I hooked what I believe is a nice cutthroat, which is amazing to me, in 1 foot of visibility. I mean, I can kind of show you when my float goes under, it actually becomes invisible. Yep, that's a nice little cutty. He's taken on some color too. These cutthroat, when these so they're not too far off from spawning either. I think these cutthroat go up all of their feeder streams pretty shortly as the temperature has risen, but that's beautiful. Definitely makes it worth the effort. Awesome. All right, so now I have worked the whole run with my floating jig. I ended up hooking up with 3 cutthroat, which is cool, no steelhead. And now I've switched over to my Colorado spinner rig, which, as I said earlier, was kind of a saving grace this year. It's very exciting that is a viable alternative for these fish, especially considering that 2 of my steelhead that I caught back to back in a short amount of time were in 34-degree water, and still decided that my Silver Colorado was worthy of their attention. And I just love this rig because that spinner is just slowly rotating right off the rocks. and even making, I believe, a sound as it's going tink, tink, tink down off the top of those rocks. And there is something about that presentation that that turns on or induces a strike in these steelhead. And it is truly, for a long time, has been one of my favorite rigs for targeting steelhead. Like I said, a lot of times when you're fishing hardware, the strike is that much more dramatic, and the fight even can, I'm thinking it's a wild fish versus hatchery fish thing, but it's well established that wild steelhead really like hardware. And by hardware, of course, I mean spoons and spinners. Well, and lo and behold, apparently the cutthroat like my Colorado as well. Man, I thought that was a steelhead when it took. My float went diving, and good hook set. That's awesome. I mean, I hope the camera does justice to the condition of this water. There is literally a foot of visibility right now at the moment. Let's see if we can get a good view of that nice little lower jaw hook set with my barbless. Nice. Nice. So for those of you who have followed my little Steelhead Notebook reports or have watched this video long enough, I think it's only fitting to put a wrap on this steelhead season with a simple acknowledgement that none of this, whether I'm talking about this steelhead season or my little Idaho farm or this feeling of peacefulness and serenity that I live with every day, none of this is possible without my sobriety. And yes, I am an active member of a 12-step fellowship that shall remain nameless. But for anybody listening and affected by such things, the reality is that for this guy, it works. And I can say that virtually everything that's happened in my life since I made that all-important decision to get help and to achieve sobriety, everything that's happened since that day, the only word I can really apply to it is glorious. My life has been such a fun ride for so long now, but what I never do is take it for granted. I have an appreciation for things that was lacking in me for a good part of my adult life, and that feeling of gratitude that I have and the need to share it with others, those were just lost ideas for a very long time. But the moral to that story is that it works. You got to do the work, but it works. And I live my life. I've never really been afraid of anything, but I choose to live my life with a deathly fear, quite literally, of that first drink. And what I do is I harness that fear, and it keeps me away from that decision making or that concept that somehow I have it figured out. And I could be that guy again. But what I know, what I've been convinced of, and what I believe is that all of this is pretty quickly lost if I were to go down that road. And in a very selfish way, I am not going to let that happen. If I think back to life with all of the magnified stresses that used to be there, and all of the anxieties and the depression and whatnot that was only enhanced by my drinking, I just want to beat myself up and say, what in the hell was I thinking? But it's not as simple as that. But back to my original point, none of this would happen. None of this would be possible if it wasn't for my sobriety, and I take that very much to heart. And a steelhead right here would be so awesome. In 1 foot of visibility right at the very, very last second of the steelheading season. But even if it doesn't happen, I'm still fishing.